thank you for the invitation to talk to your research project. I'm very interested in finding out more about it. As Silvia outlined, I've been involved in kind of research into conspiracy theories for about 10 years, and a lot has happened in those 10 years. It really has been discovered by multiple fields in academia as a research topic which deserves and perhaps even demands our attention. I think for a very, very long time, conspiracy theories were sidelined and the strategy was simply to ignore them. With events in recent years, it simply is no longer possible to ignore conspiracy theories anymore. I've been developing a number of projects, and when Silvia told me about your project, I was considering the options. I'll just mention another project that perhaps in future discussions and contexts we can also draw upon. After today, you might have heard enough from me, but I have other colleagues who are working on this project, which looks at historically the link between conspiracy theory and racism. And exactly, I thought it would resonate. Okay, well, I need to introduce you to Francois Soyer, who's in Australia, a French academic, and Reza Ebrahimi, who's in King's College in London. We're essentially looking, I mean, Francois is an expert in early modern Spain and looks at the Inquisition, looks at their persecution of the conversos, and looks at how conspiracy theories and early forms of racism emerged in that context. Reza is at the other end of the historical spectrum, looking at a more contemporary context where there's talk of a grand replacement. You've heard these ideas. I first met him when he presented on Bakior, who did this book. I forget what the title of the book is, but she has developed this. I mean, she's a conspiracy theorist who claims that there has been a conspiracy underway since the 1970s to replace the Christian populations of Europe with Islamic populations. And and in between, we're interested in looking at this interplay of racism and conspiracy theory in colonial contexts, where obviously you have encounters between Europeans and non-Europeans, but also slave societies, obviously slavery. And there was always fear, of course, that the slaves were engaging in conspiracies that would lead to rebellions. But also the other context is Nazi Germany, where if you have a look at the anti-Semitism, on the one hand, if you think about the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which our friend Michael Hagemeister, he's the expert, that's clearly conspiracy theory. If you think about the Nuremberg laws, that's racism. And there's never really, in our opinion, been a kind of a study which looks at how this racism and conspiracy theory, these different forms of anti-Semitism actually interacted and reinforced each other, or on occasion, sometimes there were disputes about what is the right way to interpret, or rather imagine, this sinister Jewish threat. Do you do it in terms of a corruption of the biological body in terms of racism, or do you do it as some kind of subversion based on conspiracy theories? So I'm just putting that out there because that would be wonderful to kind of like get the two groups perhaps in a year's time talking about this. There's lots of overlap. But today I wanted to talk about I thought I would use this opportunity to say something about the book project on which I have been working. And also, if I'm very great. I'm learning Italian at the moment. I live here in Rome for a year and a half. My Italian should be better. I'm embarrassed.
What's my English? Should be better.
No, not at all. I'm very aware that if I'm speaking too fast, if it's too complicated, please, just there's nothing wrong with saying, please, can you try to explain that again, or I don't understand. Or you can blame it on my Australian accent. You can say your Australian accent. I don't think my Australian accent is too strong, but please don't hesitate if there are things which are not clear. I will try to clarify them. Yeah, so I'll talk about my book. And I hope everyone who's participating can see the cover, which I like. My professor back in Cambridge says it's a disaster. He says it's it's something which I found in archive in the United States, and it was an attempt by a conspiracy theorist, essentially in the 1970s, to map out his grand explanation of what was happening in America from the end of World War II onwards through the Kennedy assassination right up to Watergate. Just down there you can see where. So it was kind of his schematic map in which he tried to map out his whole theory. And in some ways it just shows you the kind of like, it's like what you see sometimes in those detective series where on the wall they try to connect everything. And I think they call them kind of crazy walls, and so this is in some ways a kind of a version of that. And it is supposed to give you a sense of, the complexity that conspiracy theories can achieve. The book is essentially a conceptual history. So I was, as Silvia mentioned, I actually did my studies in Germany, and I was a little bit influenced by a tradition of German history, historiography, conceptual history, where essentially to understand a phenomenon, you look at the concepts surrounding that phenomenon. And so, I'm trying to understand conspiracy theory in this book by looking at the concept of conspiracy theory and how I try to trace the genealogy of the concept of conspiracy theory, where it came from, what are the different ingredients that have gone into it. I think a lot of the time in the books, many of the books on conspiracy theory, the attitude towards the concept is too simple. They simply say a conspiracy theory is a theory about conspiracies. And particularly if you're aware of the religious dimension, as your project is, it becomes obvious that that is not an adequate explanation of the concept. And conspiracy theories, even sometimes when just in recent days, in preparation for this lecture, I've just been listening to some of the material on QAnon, reading it, looking at the documentaries, and it's often striking how these people involved in QAnon say it's got nothing to do with conspiracy, and they have a different access. This is our concept which we project onto other phenomenon, and we have to kind of consider that, maybe conspiracy theories are not really theories, and maybe to a certain degree they don't exactly talk about conspiracies. There is a connection, but we have to reflect upon it and not just take it for granted. The story, to come back to, I'm talking in English at a university in Rome. I would love to be able to say there's more of an Italian elements to, you know that I read my Machiavelli when it comes to conspiracies and whatnot, but when it comes to conspiracy theory, the concept, I believe it really is a product of American discourse from the 19th century into the 20th century. I would be very interested to know when Teoria del Complotto started to appear in Italy. Was it Umberto Eco who was first introducing this idea, or Carlo Ginzburg or someone like that? I can imagine. Maybe there's a different explanation. I do not know. I would be interested to know. I don't know if there's an interesting story to uncover there. But yeah, sometimes these stories are more interesting than you at first expect. And maybe it was just simply a translation of Popper. Yeah. It's maybe it's interesting, maybe it's not interesting. But for the most part, the concept, I suspect that it's been translated from American English into Italian. For the most part, it is an American story, I think. And the reason why, sorry, I'll just.
even, sorry for interrupting. I think this is the translation of the English expression also, because I think that in Italian we would not use the term theory in the sense in which American and Anglophone do usually, because for us theory is not just a theory. Theory is something that is very strong, very grounded.
Yes.
Yes. So we use in the sense that it is just a theory, but it's something that, in my opinion, derives from the English expression.
Right.
We would say fantasy. We would say other words, but not theory.
Okay.
In the first place, I think. Yes.
As theory for us as a more scientific.
Yeah.
Something more solid. It's not an abstraction. It does not mean something that I can just level and just hypothesize.
Yes, I think that maybe we may see how is the history in Germany.
That would be
because I don't know if the historicism, the German historicism and Italian historicism share this idea that a theory is not just a theory.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know.
No, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, in English, I don't know if you can say it in Italian, but in English, you can, if someone puts forward some explanation that you don't agree with and you want to dismiss and reject, you can say that's just a theory. And it's a kind of like a negative use of the word theory in that it's not substantial, it's not, it's speculative. And your contributions here are interesting because they do raise the point. Your perspective is a different one onto the concept of theory, and so I mean it poses the question then also in English: why are we using the word theory for conspiracy theory when they are more like myths or fantasies or legends?
For instance, also sorry, when in a critical sense, there is also the French theory.
Yeah.
That translated in Italian, la teoria francese, it's not pejorative, it's not, but the sense is a critique. There is a critique in the idea that the French theory.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
That talking about the scientific method, the theory is more respected.
Yeah.
So it's not this, that temptation is not intended.
It's not the first sense, the first meaning in the Italian language.
Okay, well but that is interesting. I mean, it's good that this is. That my approach has already stimulated this discussion because it shows me that perhaps, I mean, sometimes people say, oh, people approach conspiracy theory and they want stories about, like the Illuminati, and I will talk about the Illuminati later on, but talking about the concepts, people think, oh, that's boring. But I think it's actually really worthwhile reflecting upon these concepts and yeah, I mean, theory in English, yeah, it's interesting. I think it's not going to be in this book, but I've got another chapter on Karl Popper. And Popper, of course, is important because, I mean, he is a philosopher of science. He's thinking about methodology. He's distinguishing between theories and hypotheses in some contexts. And he comes up with the notion of a conspiracy theory of society. That's the full concept for him, conspiracy theory of society. it would be interesting just to consider more what Popper was trying to achieve. Well, my argument is Popper was calling what is essentially a myth or a fantasy. He said, let's call it a theory so that we can refute it and move on to the next thing. Because the thing is that, of course, with a myth or with a legend or a fantasy, you can't refute that. But if you turn it into a theory, you can, and that's part of his scientific approach.
But also, this is my hypothesis about Popper, is that he uses the idea of conspiracy theory of society within a book that was written to antagonize Marxism, historicism, so theory.
Yes.
Theories.
Yeah.
So, and in some way, conspiracy theory is considered by Popper, so to say, a sort of source for historicism, a sort of concept.
I mean, he is a little bit careful there. He actually says Marx is not a conspiracy theorist, and he says that, but he talks about vulgar Marxism, which is the way that Marxism collapses into a conspiracy theory of the capitalists controlling society and whatnot. But I mean, I need to think more about Popper. There will be, as I said, this book was ambitious and it fell apart. And so what has fallen out is the chapter on Popper, which is a bit strange because for most people, Popper is where it begins with the conspiracy theory of society in his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. But the Open Society, I mean, one of the interesting things about this is the Open Society and its enemies. You can ask yourself, how much of a conspiracy theory is that? And this is what I'm talking about today in a hall of mirrors, the mimesis. That's, I think, something which we encounter repeatedly in with conspiracy theories. So let me just, I'll keep it short today because I know that it's going to be a long day for you. I've just seen the program. I want to outline my general argument, then I will go through 3 historical examples, and then I will just try to analyze quickly what we can learn from those historical examples. So the reason I think the concept is a difficult concept is because if you do the genealogy, which is what my book is trying to present, you will find there is no singular point of origin where someone invents the concept of conspiracy theory. It's different with other concepts sometimes, and but with conspiracy theory, we see this concept emerge in 2 different contexts, and eventually they come together. And the reason why we feel ambivalent about the concept and why we have difficulties defining what a conspiracy theory is because if you actually trace the genealogy of the concept, you see it's drawing upon 2 different things. And the first context is basically the intersection of law and journalism and criminal investigations, forensics, in the second half of the 19th century. That's when it begins. And conspiracy theory here has a very neutral, today we are dismissive of conspiracy theories. That's a pejorative concept. We use it negatively. But in this original context of law and journalism and criminal investigations, it was neutral. It was also very specific. No one ever spoke about conspiracy theories. It was always directed towards a specific explanation for a specific crime that had occurred. And so just here, you will see the assassination in 1881 of President Garfield. So I think he's the 2nd American president to be assassinated after Lincoln had been assassinated, obviously, in about 20 years earlier. So Garfield was shot, and there was in the days afterwards, Garfield survived for another 6 weeks, but then he eventually died. But in the days immediately after the assassination, there was speculation about whether Charles Guiteau, the assassin, was really working alone or whether he had other people helping him in the background, whether there was a conspiracy. And so we have here just a little kind of, you can see conspiracy theory, and I don't know how legible that is, if it's easy to read, but essentially the article is, there were other articles in the newspapers appearing with this headline talking about the conspiracy theory, and this one just simply dismisses it. Says, you know, people have considered the conspiracy theory, but there is no evidence to support the conspiracy theory. So, I mean, and there is nothing wrong, there's nothing illegitimate or invalid about proposing a conspiracy theory once there has been an assassination. This tradition continues right up into the 1960s, and you can still find people after, for example, the assassination of Kennedy in 1963. So there's an article from the New York Review of Books called The Second Oswald. It's an interesting article, but let me just focus on the title, The Case for a Conspiracy Theory, the argument for a conspiracy theory. And so obviously when this particular writer is putting forward the argument for a conspiracy theory, he's just using it, you know, saying there is evidence to suggest that Lee Harvey Oswald was not acting alone, that there's something more sinister going on, and this is the argument for a conspiracy theory that I want people to consider. So, I mean, this is someone using the term for their own argument. Subsequently, we find that we use it for the arguments of others to dismiss those arguments. But in the 1960s, it was still possible to say, I have an explanation, it's a conspiracy theory. That changes because we have another context from which the concept emerges, or which produces another version of the concept. And that is essentially social science, social philosophy, engaging with ideology and recognizing in those ideologies modernized, secularized versions of old religious beliefs, and saying that those explanations have no part to play in proper explanations of history and of society. So Karl Popper, we just mentioned before, it comes up in 1948 in a number of lectures. He begins to talk about the conspiracy theory of society. It's a negative concept, obviously, because he's saying that it's an illegitimate way of explaining the world, and it should be rejected. And perhaps he calls it a theory because he believes that by calling it a theory, then you can refute it and reject it. The other person who is important in the book that I'm writing is Franz Neumann, who was a member of the Frankfurt School, wrote a Behemoth, an account of Nazi Germany. But after World War II, he became a professor of political science at Columbia. 1954, he was also involved in building up the Free University in Berlin. And in 1954, he went to Berlin to give a lecture to receive an honorary degree. And on that occasion, he gave a lecture which had a large part of it was devoted to what he called the conspiracy theory of history. And I mean, the agenda was different from Popper's, but not too dissimilar. I mean, this was social science, looking at something which Neumann believed was kind of like a way in which certain dictators controlled the people by using modern ideology, modernized forms of kind of like religious beliefs, essentially. He called that the conspiracy theory of history. Once more, a very negative kind of take on what a conspiracy theory of history is. It was something that did not belong within the discussion of social science. And in the 1960s, you start to see these two traditions of talking about conspiracy theory, they start to collide. And so just as one example, I've called it semantic slippage, which is a little bit abstract perhaps, but it just shows you how, because on the one hand, we have this tradition of talking about crimes in terms of conspiracy theory, and then on the other hand, we have this tradition of critiquing ideologies, calling them the conspiracy theory of society, the conspiracy theory of history. Because there is this resemblance, people start to believe that they are that they are essentially the same thing. So just as an example, we have here this journalist, I.V. Stone, who was a kind of an independent journalist in America in the second half of during the Cold War period, producing his own newsletter. But on a number of occasions, there was a profile, I think this is taken from the Wall Street Journal. He says, I don't believe in the conspiracy theory of history. So that's what Neumann had been talking about. And he says, I rejected the rightist theory of a communist conspiracy, which is in some ways what the conspiracy theory of history, it's a version of the conspiracy theory of history. And then he says, and I couldn't accept the leftist theory of a plot to kill Kennedy. And that's the other tradition of talking about conspiracy theory. But you see here, he's making a kind of an equivalent. He's saying, I'm independent. I didn't go with the right when they were talking about the communist, the anti-communist conspiracy theory of history. And I didn't go with the left when they were suspicious about the circumstances behind Kennedy's assassination. And he's saying that the two things are essentially equivalent, where I would actually say that there's a little bit of a false equivalence occurring here, but that's what is happening conceptually. These two traditions are merging to create a problematic concept. And I have lots of other examples where I can show you from the 1960s into the 1970s. You have people drawing on the one hand on this tradition of critiquing ideology, which goes back to Popper and Neumann, and then also using that then to critique explanations of assassinations in particular, and Watergate and political scandals. Now, I want to so I talked about this semantic slippage where the conspiracy theory of history and conspiracy theory get reduced to essentially what we today call simply conspiracy theory. But in writing this book, I became aware of another kind of semantic slippage, which I see all the time, and it's how conspiracy theory gets reduced to simply conspiracy. And if you have a look in the media today, you find many occasions on which it's clear that people are talking about conspiracy theories, but they just say conspiracy. Now, once more, you might say this is very pedantic, Andrew. We can kind of work out from the context that actually they mean conspiracy theory. That is true, but I think there's something else at work, and that brings us to what I was kind of referencing earlier and what is actually the theme of this talk, the kind of mimetic properties of conspiracy theories, that conspiracy theories often appear in conspiratorial contexts. The conspiracy theories don't just describe a conspiracy, but they are part of a conspiracy theory themselves. So, I mean, I've just been looking at some of this material on QAnon as I've been. I never really engaged with QAnon as a researcher, and certainly not as someone who believes in it. But I never engaged in it. But in these last days, I have, and it's just struck me again and again how this substituting conspiracy for conspiracy theory. Just as an example here, I'm just quoting from this book by Mia Bloom and Sophia Moskalenko, Pastels and Pedophiles, which is a book that came out in 2021 examining QAnon, the QAnon movement. It says there, conspiracy theories are a common way to explain a precarious world. People seek plausible explanations when things go wrong. Conspiracies offer comfort and reassurance, etc., etc. Now, clearly, what she means, that what the authors mean there is conspiracy theories offer comfort, not conspiracies. And once more, it's clear, and you might say this is not so important, this is pedantic, but I really do believe that when you have a look at QAnon, there is so much about the actual movement itself and the origins of the movement, which is like a conspiracy, that I think that in general, perhaps not in this particular example, but I think what promotes this slippage where conspiracy theory is reduced to conspiracy is something which is true of conspiracy theories in general, and that is that they appear and are used for conspiratorial purposes. And that's why, you know, I've been trying to use the metaphor of a hall of mirrors. It becomes very, very confusing because the conspiracy theory, as I just said before, describes a conspiracy, but also the conspiracy theory is used as an instrument in something that is a conspiracy or is certainly conspiratorial. So, I mean, when you come to another book on QAnon, where, you know, it says the subtitle here, this is by the journalist Will Sommer, he says, "The Rise of QAnon and the Conspiracy That Reshaped America." Now, at first I'm thinking, perhaps he really means conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theory that QAnon puts forward about the deep state and et cetera, et cetera. We can go into the details later. But perhaps it's right, actually, in this context to simply use conspiracy, because when you consider the QAnon movement, where it came from, there is something about it which is actually like a conspiracy. And so it's not entirely clear to me whether this is an example where, in actual fact, you would say, well, sorry, you were trying to actually, you're talking about the conspiracy theory that reshaped America. It might be the case that, you know, it's a legitimate use of the word conspiracy here, that he's talking about the QAnon movement as a conspiracy in itself. Yeah. So as I said, it gets confusing. So tell me if it's kind of like,
No.
okay, so let me just quickly go through these historical examples and jump back to kind of periods of the past with which I am more familiar than QAnon. This is so I'll begin with a rather obscure example. Here is a picture of an arrest occurring on the night of March the 24th, 1794, in the German university town of Gießen. And we're talking about a period, obviously, where the French Revolution had occurred 5 years before. There are anxieties within these small German principalities that the principles and the ideas of the French Revolution will spread and will cause the people to rebel. These are principles, obviously, the French Revolution, égalité, fraternité, liberté, which are at odds with the notion of a feudal hierarchical society, which still exists in these little principalities. And so the man who is carrying out the arrest here his name is Ludwig Adolf Christian Grohmann. And he's arresting a university lecturer who is suspected of spreading the ideology of the French Revolution. This arrest was part of Grohmann's campaign to suppress sedition and to fight back against this ideology. But he did so in a number of ways, not just by making arrests, but also by publishing pamphlets. And I think this is a remarkable pamphlet, which has received a little bit more attention in recent years, has been kind of discovered as a striking form of a conspiracy theory. So, I mean, Nachrichten von einem großen, aber unsichtbaren Bunde, so news of a large and invisible association, a Bund, is a kind of like, I guess that's how you would translate that. The argument, I won't need to, you can, a league is actually a good way, exactly, yeah, exactly. A Bund is also, you can say, a league. But if you just look at this, the image here, you can see what is, you can see a nice illustration of the core argument in the book. And that is, you have these conspirators, these figures hiding behind a curtain, and then beyond that you can see a throne is being pushed over, representing obviously the princes and the kings. And beyond that you can see a church is being demolished, a church is being torn down, representing the kind of destruction of Christianity and of religion. And so, I mean, there are two figures there, actually. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I've never thought of that. But I mean, Grollman identifies two problems. He says we have these attacks against authority, political and religious authority, occurring in the public domain, in journals, in publications, and on that level, a kind of a public attack. But we also have the secret societies who are spreading these ideas, secret societies like the Illuminati. Grollman himself was a member of the Illuminati for a short period, actually. The question is, of course, you'll notice that Grollman's name is actually not on the on this frontispiece, on the title page of this pamphlet. So the question, the legitimate question, is how do we actually know that this is Grollman who wrote this pamphlet? And it's a good question, and we actually do not have the final proof, but there's so much circumstantial evidence which points to Grollman as the author of this particular pamphlet. And one of the reasons why we are confident in attributing the pamphlet to Grollman is because later, well, in that year, so I was showing you there just with the last slide, the pamphlet had actually appeared in the first edition in 1794. In 1794, Grollman writes a letter to another interesting figure, Johann Georg Zimmermann, who was also of a similar opinion to Grollman about this subversion of the old order by these dangerous forces. And Grollman wrote a long letter, and in this letter, so this is a private letter, and in this letter we find phrases that are repeated in the pamphlet. So the same phrases get repeated in the pamphlet, presumably because Grollman had just written the pamphlet and then he writes the letter at the same time. And to express his ideas to Zimmermann, he uses the same ideas. So that's just one indication that Grollman was the author. In this letter, this private letter, let me just point out two things about it. He explains to his correspondent at Zimmermann that he has this plan to create a counter association opposing the devilish union. And with the devilish union, he means the Illuminati. And his idea is that if there is the Illuminati as a kind of a conspiracy against the old order, then we have to create our own counter conspiracy to push back against them. The way to fight a conspiracy is with another conspiracy. And so even here, you kind of like, this is kind of like mimesis. This is a kind of like repeating what they are fighting against. There's another aspect of the letter which is also interesting. And I was, so that's my daughter and Kermit the Frog in the front of in a cemetery. I actually was there just, this wasn't planned. I was in Weimar. And I noticed when I was in the cemetery, I knew that before, but I'd forgotten about the fact that this particular German publicist and someone who was very enthusiastic about secret societies, Johann Joachim Christoph Boulder, is buried in this cemetery. And so I got my wife to take a photo of us. In 1794, Grollman wrote an article in which he claimed that Boulder, whose grave this is, Boulder had travelled to Paris in 1787. He had undertaken a journey to Paris. And Grollman claimed that the reason Boulder, who was a member of the Illuminati, the reason that Boulder had gone to Paris was to prepare the French Revolution in 1787. Of course, the French Revolution breaks out 2 years later in 1789. In the letter, which I just showed you to Zimmermann, he then actually says, you know what, I've actually thought about that connection and I don't actually think it's true. I don't think that there was this spreading of, I don't think the Illuminati spread the ideas to Paris and prepared the French Revolution like that. In 1795 though, he does write another pamphlet where he repeats his claim that the Illuminati from Germany spread the ideas to Paris, and that prepared the French Revolution. Now, you could say, of course, well, maybe he's just going back and changing his mind, possibly. But more likely is the fact that he's lying. He's lying. He's saying one thing in public, but behind the scenes, in his private correspondence, he is saying another. He's saying that I don't actually really believe that, but for propaganda purposes, he is pushing this lie that the Illuminati were behind the French Revolution. Let's just jump to a second case study, and I'll keep it short because the expert, who unfortunately, of course, could not attend last time you invited him, but Michael Hagermeister, I actually have taken this collection of images from Michael Hagermeister, so thank you to Michael for the use of this particular slide, where Michael has collected all these different editions of the protocols of the elders of Zion. I presume some of you might know a little bit about this notorious document. It appeared in 1903 for the first time in a, well, the whole, this is where Michael Hagermeister's research is so illuminating and so important, along with Cesare de Michele. So, yeah, have you ever met him?
No.
Right.
No.
Because he lives in Rome, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. No. I thought it was. So
Oh.
I don't want to record.
I also wondered, yeah. No, because, yeah, they are the two prominent researchers on this field, yeah. And I've also been, I think he's retired, obviously, and so I don't know if he's really active still in the research. But, I mean, what is important about his research is that I think he puts forward persuasive arguments about identifying who were the people behind the protocols. I mean, of course, the claim of the protocols is that they are the minutes from, or not even the minutes. This is where I need Michael Hagermeister to correct me here. But I mean, it is a plan for a Jewish plan, an alleged Jewish plan, to undermine the old European Christian society by introducing many of the things that we associate with modernity, such as democracy, political parties, public finance, a public sphere with journalism, a critical public sphere. All of this is traced back to some very insidious Jewish plan. And it's clear that anonymity plays an important role here also. I mean, a very important role, because obviously these people who actually produced the protocols could not identify themselves, because the whole conceit, the whole trick is based upon the notion that it is actually a Jewish plan. And what became obvious after World War I and after the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Revolution, of course, was important because many of these conservative Russians took copies of the protocols, and I mean, they spread the protocols throughout the world, and the protocols by this stage were seen as, in some ways, they have been verified by the Russian Revolution, which had occurred, and the Bolsheviks taking power in Russia. What is important is that in 1921, they identified where the protocols had come from and that they were basically a plagiarism. Philip Graves, who was a journalist for the London Times, received a tip-off, essentially, from a Russian figure. He was the Times correspondent in Istanbul. And this Russian figure, who has been identified, but he alerted him to the fact that, in actual fact, the protocols, to a very large degree, about 40% of the protocols could be traced back to a document, to a pamphlet which had been produced in 1864 and which had been forgotten about. Once more anonymous, but it was written by a French lawyer, Maurice Joly, Dialogue aux enfers entre Machiavel and Montesquieu, so the dialogue in hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. It was a critique of Napoleon III in France, but obviously certain Russian figures had come across it and identified in it a useful source of material for this fabricated plan. What is important, just once more, is to emphasize that we have here a lie. And I mean, in many of the early, I mean, it begins with a lie. These people putting forward this document under false pretenses. And I just want to draw out a particular aspect that, I mean, we have the anonymity once more, but we have a lie. We have people claiming a document to be something that it is actually not. To jump to just a last example, and that's QAnon, which I've already mentioned a couple of times. I've got there a picture of the first Q drop, as they were called. These were the messages that were posted anonymously to a message board, 4chan, the first one on October the 28th, 2017, predicting that 2 days later, Hillary Clinton would be arrested. And it's interesting that in some ways this prediction, of course, never came true, but that did not stop the rise of Q and this QAnon movement. Q being apparently this security official working within the American state against the American deep state, and the more lurid or the more extravagant claim is, of course, this deep state is somehow linked to a pedophile cabal involved in satanic rituals in which children are murdered and their blood is used as a source of, I think they call it adrenochrome. It's a modern version of the old myth of the old anti-Semitic myth that the Jews murder Christian children for their blood. It seems to be kind of like a new version of that. These Q drops were posted on these message boards, firstly 4chan, and I think then it transited to 8chan. There were 5,000 Q drops. I don't think, from what I understand, it's not continuing anymore, but there were 5,000 such messages, some of them long, some of them very, very short. And a lot of people then became intrigued. The messages are very cryptic. They need interpretation. These certain intermediary figures then would take the messages and present them in ways that were more digestible for the public. And I mean, they often made money out of them also. There was, lots of merchandise which they could sell. They were often they would get subscriptions through, or donations for people who would follow their blogs, their websites, updating everyone on what the latest Q drop was and what is the possible interpretation of it was. And of course, the fact that they were making money from it then raises the question, do they really believe in it? And just one of the books that I just read in recent times says, on the surface, there's no reason to think that Q promoters, so the people who were spreading this idea of Q, who have monetized their activities, so are making a profit from their activities, they are making money off it. But that doesn't mean that they don't believe it too. Why should Q's most vocal promoters somehow have more perspective or skepticism than the mass or its believers? So, I mean, it's possible to make money and profit off something that you also believe in at the same time. But what is clear is that there was anonymity once more, as you can see. I mean, it even says up there with that first, so anonymity / secrecy, and there was also a lie. I mean, I have to admit, we have not identified who Q actually was. There are lots of very plausible suspicions about who was behind this. Whether it was actually just one person or a number of people, there's different speculation there. But the claims are so implausible that I think we can kind of say that it was clearly a deception. There was someone pretending to be a security official in the American state, but obviously was not. And so once more, we have not just, anonymity and secrecy, we also have deception occurring once more. So I want to just finish by saying, I don't think all conspiracy theories are necessarily based in deception. It is possible to, we can point to a few examples of conspiracy theories where they are honest attempts made by people to understand complicated things that are happening in the world. But I think also to really understand what is going on with this phenomenon of conspiracy theory, we have to take into account that a lot of the time there is deception, and this creates this hall of mirrors that I have been talking about. I just wanted to go through, just as a quick analysis, the various kind of ways. So C in this analysis that I've just meant, I've just kind of put this together in the last days. C equals conspiracy. And conspiracy can give rise to a counter-conspiracy. So C gives rise to C. So here from a new edition of Salus's accounts of the Catalan conspiracy, he writes, the editor, who writes an introduction, says at one point, one part of stopping a conspiracy, Salus shows, is to launch a counter-conspiracy. As the conspirator plots secretly, his opponents must do the same. The opponent must cultivate secret informants, covertly gathering evidence and sharing it only when it becomes overwhelming. So this idea that, you know, conspiracies give rise to counter-conspiracies. We saw it with Grollman. Grollman was saying there that, you know, we have the Illuminati, this conspiracy. I'm going to create my own counter-conspiracy. I actually have been thinking about it in recent days because my university, we're going through major structural changes at the moment, and so some of my colleagues have been saying it's a conspiracy at the top. But I mean, what we have done is that then we have formed our own little community where we no longer use the university accounts for our email, for our communications. We've moved on to Gmail and WhatsApp. And so, I mean, we've created our own little counter-conspiracy to push back. And I think this is just kind of like part of ordinary politics in many ways. You have, you know, people conspiring.
Secrecy and power.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, you have a maneuver and a strategy and a counter-strategy. And I don't think that in this context, the conspiracy theory emerges as something distinct. But it can, obviously. And so, I mean, I also want to consider this other possibility that conspiracy theories give rise to other conspiracy theories. And a friend of mine, Joseph Yashinsky, wrote an important book back in 2014. But he says, you know, conspiracy theories beget is a strange English word for, you know, give birth to. Conspiracy theories give birth to more conspiracy theories. Just as one example, I was reading an article by Edward J. Epstein, written in 1967, I believe, 1968, about Jim Garrison. Some of you might have seen Oliver Stone's famous film about called JFK, which is based on Jim Garrison, this attorney in New Orleans.
Pretty controversial figure.
Yes, exactly. Very controversial because, I mean, one of the things that he was also doing was claiming that anything that opposed his investigation or any kind of obstacle that he encountered was part of what he called the second conspiracy, which is why he was saying that anytime that what I claim about the first conspiracy being the conspiracy to kill Kennedy, the assassination, and he said that if there's ever any kind of evidence against that, it's been planted there by the second conspiracy. And you can kind of see in this way that this mimesis is also important for understanding why conspiracy theories become unfalsifiable or irrefutable. It becomes very hard to falsify a conspiracy theory because always the argument for the falsification, the evidence for that, can be seen as part of another conspiracy, and sometimes obviously the two conspiracies get rolled into the one conspiracy. But I think it's also the mimesis is also important for understanding this property of conspiracy. You might have read the essay by Cass Sunstein. He's an American political theorist. I think it's called Conspiracy Theories, Causes and Cures. It made an impact back in, was it in the early 2014, perhaps around the same time. But he talked about conspiracy theories are self-sealing. It becomes very hard to refute them and convince people that they are wrong, because every attempt to convince them that they are wrong is seen as being part of either another conspiracy or, you know, part of the same conspiracy. What we were looking at, well, let me just simply say that what the conspiracy theory itself claims is that there is a conspiracy which is mirrored by a conspiracy theory. That is the claim put forward by the conspiracy theory itself. But in conclusion, I think look, what I was really interested in today was looking at how conspiracy theories themselves feed into conspiracies. And here, let me qualify that, because I will say that it's not always, perhaps you will say, simply publishing a pamphlet anonymously is not really a conspiracy, but it involves elements of what we associate with conspiracies, namely secrecy and anonymity a lot of the time. And also, of course, these conspiracy theories are used for purposes which are in themselves, which are conspiratorial. The deception of a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy theory, as I've been saying, doesn't just describe a deception in itself. A lot of the time, it itself is part of a deception. Deception, we can call it a lie. And I was just reading also Hannah Arendt's famous essay on politics and truth, where I think it's important because she says that, there's a section there which looks at the lie. And she says that a lie is a form of political action, is a form of action. Telling the truth, just trying to give an account of the world, in certain circumstances that can be a form of action, particularly where there are lies occurring, and to simply stand up and say, this is the truth, that can be a form of action. But there are other circumstances where telling the truth is just representing the world as you see it. It's not, it's representation, it's not action, according to these distinctions that Hannah Arendt was making. She says, though, that the lie, by always deviating from what you know to be the truth, is a form of action. And I think she says the liar is a man of action. She speaks of the undeniable affinity of lying with action. I think this is important, and I think this is actually just to finish now. I think this is where your project can really make a contribution, because if we have a look at a lot of the work produced by philosophers and even the psychologists, they look at conspiracy theories and they say they are attempts to understand the world, they are attempts to mirror the world in a form of mimesis, you might say, also. But they are simply attempts to kind of describe reality. And they don't take into account another dimension of conspiracy theories, which is that they are forms of action. They are ways in which you do things. And of course, with the FreeBeRi project, you're interested in hate speech. It's quite clear that hate speech is a form of speech that is a form of action. And I think, therefore, that, this aspect of conspiracy theories, where we've been simply looking at them as kind of honest attempts to grapple with reality, if we take into account the fact that they are very often forms of deception, forms of action, hateful and hurtful forms of action, we can see that there really is important work to be done by your project. So I'm looking forward to hearing about the outputs and the results of what you discover.
Thank you very much.